of different kinds. We also acknowledge, recognize that often a professionally qualified teacher is not available for children, or we acknowledge and recognize that the teachers who are there may not have the right academic qualifications to be working with children. So these kinds of anomalies are common in the system. But we have not yet in the policy space begun to systematically recognize issues of the availability of the right teacher in deployment of teachers. Also, the right to education promises many kinds of curricular experiences for students. It envisions an education in which physical education, art, music will be as much a part of the core curriculum as the curricular subjects. So this kind of holistic notion of having the right teacher for every child is a very central issue, and we thought we would focus this report on that. The State of Teachers, Teaching and Teacher Education report itself is a biennial report of the Center of Excellence in Teacher Education. This is a report that we are bringing out once in 2 years, where we want to draw attention to issues of the sector and draw attention to where are teachers today, what is the status, what are the working conditions, where are teachers, what is their demographic profile, and what should the overall policy orientation be working towards. So I want to just introduce to you both some of the wider trends so that we understand this person called the teacher, who all of you are working with. The entire system is kind of, in the MP case with the FLN mission, is focused on helping and supporting teachers to improve and change their practice in the classroom. So this report and what I will share with you today will give you a broader picture of teachers in India. And hopefully we will also have opportunities to locate more specifically teachers in the MP context within this wider national scale. So can we go to the next slide, Shobha? So the second report, I will today be talking to you about the demographic profile of teachers in different sectors. We'll be talking a little bit about working conditions, the availability and the supply of teachers in generally, and specifically the supply of qualified teachers, and also make comparisons between states, between urban and rural areas, between the government and private sectors. And as I proceed with the presentation, I think we will have an opportunity to reflect specifically on the context of MP in relation to other states in India, questions of urban-rural differences, more widely prevalent and definitely very important in the MP case, considering the extent to which MP is basically rural, and also looking at differences between the government and private sectors. You will be interested to know that MP ranks among the states with very high proportions of teachers in the private sector. Between 40 to 50% of all teachers in MP actually are in the private sector. So you can recognize the importance of understanding the private sector as well. Can we go to the next slide? Now, this report took over a year to prepare. It's quite a complex report, and we have drawn on many data sources in order to build the understanding that I will be sharing with you today. So some of the key data sources, first of all, UDICE. I'm sure all of you have had opportunities to look at and work with UDICE. It's an amazing data set, although the questions are constantly raised about the quality of data in it, especially where government schools are concerned. UDICE is fairly robust, and anomalies are not, glaringly problematic in the UDICE. So UDICE is an amazing data source, and we have, mined UDICE to draw attention to questions of teachers. The periodic labor force survey is another very, very interesting and important data source. Once a quarter, the National Sample Survey Organization samples the status of employment. So it's actually a survey of the labor force. And interestingly, within the survey, we are also able to capture information about teachers who are a part of the labor force. And the periodic labor force survey gives us very, very important data and understanding of teachers, which we don't find in UDICE, for example. And it also gives us an opportunity to actually understand the government versus the private sector, the urban versus the rural sector. And we ourselves conducted a primary survey. We surveyed 8 states in India, which were selected, from the north, east, south, and the west. And we gathered data at the school level, and also from teacher education institutions. And finally, we were able to access data from the teacher eligibility test of one state. And we used that data to understand quality of teacher education. So I'm going to, before we move to the next slide, I also just want to draw your attention to the fact that we have 8 background papers, which are the base research reports from which this report that I'm presenting to you is drawn. So if any of you is interested in the detailed analysis, you can go to any of these 8 papers, which are available also on the SoTTTTER website. So we've looked at contact teachers in India, and there's some really important issues of contact teachers in the context of MP. We have, of course, full reports on the SoTTTTER data. We've also looked at newspaper surveys, newspapers and reports of teachers in the newspaper to understand how teachers and teachers' issues are portrayed in the national media. Okay, so let's move on and dive into the report itself. So there are about 9.5 million teachers in India. So we are among the largest teaching workforce systems in the country. And out of this, 70% of teachers are in the rural areas. 49, that's about 50% work in government schools, 8% in private schools, and 37% in private schools. This, the number of teachers in the private sector is actually growing. It grew by about 3% from our last report to this one. So this is a growing sector, and typically most teachers find their first employment in the private sector. And we are finding that almost even teachers in the government schools typically have already worked in private schools between 3 to 7 years before they can transition into a government school job. So a very significant proportion of the workforce is in the private sector. The states with the largest teaching workforce on the top is UP. 16% of all teachers in India, whether government or private sector, work in the UP state, which means approximately 1 in 6, 1 in 7 teachers is in the state of UP. That gives you the sense of the size of the proportion of school students and teachers in that one state. Maharashtra accounts for 8% of all teachers. Rajasthan is another 8%. And MP is again a very, very large system. It accounts for 6% of all teachers in India. And this gives you an idea of the extent of school teachers, school children who are also, from that state. These are really the young states with very large proportions of school-going children. Although 49% of teachers are employed in the government sector, 11% of government school teachers are actually contractually employed. And very high levels of contractualization within the government sector are found in the northeast states of India. In Assam, it's 24%, and in Meghalaya, it's as high as 69%. Just think of it. Meghalaya is a state which has significant government school sector, but almost 70% of these government school teachers are only contractually employed. And this gives you an idea of the issues of recruitment, deployment, and legal cases many states are dealing with, which prevents timely and regular recruitment to take place. The state of Madhya Pradesh is significant, along with Bihar and Delhi. These states significantly reduced the extent of contractual teachers between 2013-14 and 2021-22 by 15 to 17%. So actually, in the case of Madhya Pradesh, it seems as if the contractualization of teachers has come down and more teacher employment is regularized. But when we deep dive into the nature of this so-called regularization, we find that actually in MP, new cadres of teachers have been created who are not strictly considered as government employees. They are quasi-government employees, and they don't enjoy the same recruitment and cadre rules as a full government employee does. So they are not counted as government servants in a strict sense, and they don't enjoy many of the benefits that a government employee does. The pay scales are also different. Although today, from the political pressure that contractual teachers have exerted, they have been able to achieve many benefits, such as pay during vacation and retirement, ensured employment until the age of retirement. They have been until the age of 60, which is strictly speaking not retirement, but until the age of 60. So they have been able to secure certain benefits, but still they are not actually regular teachers. So this apparent reduction of contractual teachers in Madhya Pradesh is a question of how the data has been managed, rather than actually increasing the recruitment into the earlier professional teacher cadre. Another feature that we find in MP, which is really important, is that many teachers in the MP system are guest teachers. And you must have encountered such guest teachers already. You would have encountered them you would have met them in the government school system. You would also have met very large numbers of guest teachers in the ashram shalas and the tribal schools in tribal regions. These teachers have been working on this guest teacher mode for many, many years. And ironically, they are not counted in DICE. So this is actually one of those pieces of missing data. There are teachers in the system called guest teachers, but not counted in DICE. And MP is a state that stands out as important to understand from this point of view. The pupil-teacher ratios, when we look at it at the national level, look fairly good. It's 28:1. But we all know that the real story of pupil-teacher ratio has to be understood at the school level. And the right to education is not talking about a pupil-teacher ratio at the state level, aggregated at the district or state or national level. It's really talking about a pupil-teacher ratio at the school level, and wanting that the ratio be 1:30, that every cohort of 30 students has one teacher, and the average class size is kept at 30 in the primary school stage. So I'll have more to tell you about the pupil-teacher ratio as we deep dive into states and further beyond that into schools. We find that in the government school sectors, there is reasonably well represented. The teachers from the SC and ST communities are reasonably represented, but we don't find them very much in the private school sector. They're primarily in the government school sector. And later on, I will also deep dive into availability of women teachers from the SC/ST communities to give us a picture of that. Let's move to the next slide, Shobha. Now, when we look at it overall, the women in the workforce is about 51%. So we get this, in fact, perhaps many of you expected the proportion to be even more. Maybe you expected that the women in the teaching workforce would be much higher. And interestingly, we find that it is about 50%. And there is huge variation depending on the level of school, the sector, rural, urban, in the proportion of women in the workforce. We find that only 44% of the government school teachers are actually women. And most of these women who are in government schools are in urban areas. So the rural government teacher workforce is largely male. Probably many of you have already experienced this and noticed this in your working on the field. It is the private school sector which is very, very feminized. 63% of private school teachers are women, and over 73% of private school teachers in urban areas are women. So the private teacher workforce is highly feminized compared to the government teacher workforce. We find that only 35% of tribal welfare school teachers are women. So the proportion of women from in the tribal welfare schools and proportion of women work from the ST community is actually quite low. 85% of the ECCE workforce is women, and that is because of the policy of the ECCE sector, the Anganwadi, to employ women. And only 16% of physical education teachers are women. So we can see that there are huge gender differences. I connect this issue of gender differences back to the question of the right teacher in every class. It has been widely recognized that having gender balance in the teaching workforce is very important for the students. Students need to see in the teaching workforce their own gender and social categories. So it is ideal that the teaching workforce reflects the demographic profile of the student clientele. So we would want to have more gender balance in the teaching workforce. We would want the teaching workforce to more in a balanced way, represent all the social sectors. But we find that this is not the case. So again, the national metrics look better than when we dive into the details of where these teachers are distributed and the gender characteristics. I'm sure you already recognize the impact that it can have on physical education of girls when only 16% of physical education teachers are women. I'm sure you will also recognize the impact that the teaching profile will have on the willingness of tribal girls or parents to send girls to school in the tribal areas. So having gender balance across all sectors is a significant thing that we should be thinking about. We find that there are huge differences in gender balance between states. And for example, 81% of teachers in Chandigarh are women. So it's so feminized, highly feminized. And this is the government sector. And in Tripura, it's just 35%. We also found that the representation of women in the school head positions is very, very low. For example, although 63% of private school teachers are women, 71% of, only 37% of the school heads are women. So you can already see how the, women don't seem to rise to positions of administrative authority, and they stay as school teachers. We looked at the availability of teachers with disabilities, and we find that it is reasonably representative of the overall, demography of physical education teachers. The median age of teachers is about 38. We find that in government urban schools is about 44%, and in private schools it's much younger. It's 32 years of age. I think that the age of teachers is important for us to understand and work with more, and it for two reasons. One is, of course, as we profile the age group of teachers, we also can know when do we have to plan for teacher replacement. Because we know when teachers are retiring, when they're going to exit from the workforce, and then what should be the expected supply of teachers into the workforce. So understanding the age profile of teachers is important. But also for all of you who are working with systems that work with teachers, we know that based on where you are in your own professional life cycle, your entire relationship and with professional development will change. Right now, the professional development plans for teachers don't reflect either their age or their experience in the teaching career. All teachers are treated as same. In fact, whether you're teaching for the first year or you're a teacher who has taught 10 or 15 years in the system, there is no differentiation in the system for teachers based on their age. When everybody enters the school, receives a timetable, starts teaching. But I'm sure you have already experienced personally the very different professional identities, confidence, energy levels, enthusiasm for revision and change that you will find based on where teachers are in their own professional life cycle. And so understanding age demography of teachers will help us, it can guide us to approach professional development with a more differentiated lens. Yeah. We can go to the next slide. The one point that, and as Shobha is switching the slide, the one point that I want to add about the demography is that when we deep dived into contractual teachers, we found that whether it was government, even in the government sector, the younger teacher workforce is getting much more feminized. In fact, when we look at new entrance into the teaching profession, even in government schools, we're finding it is as high, women is as high as 70%. So the older teacher workforce is mostly male, but the younger teacher workforce is mostly women. This will give us an idea of how perceptions of status is probably changing. It's also linked to the availability of more educated women today seeking employment as teachers. And it's also linked to this broad perception that teaching is good for women. It seems to be there widely socially. So if we have to think about, improving status and working conditions of teachers, we have to also deal with these perceptions of what is a good job for women, what kind of service conditions do women merit, not only in terms of, physical working conditions, but also pay, remuneration, and so on. So this is something to just keep in mind about the attractiveness of the workforce. And remember, I pointed out to you that it is desirable that the teaching workforce should reflect the demography of a region. Let's move to the next slide. Now, as I already pointed out to you, I flagged to you that this at the national level, this pupil-teacher ratio looks good. So, in fact, every time the question is raised about teacher availability and the need for more teachers, it is very typical for the central government to say, look, at the national level, it's at 28:1, and that's a very good ratio. But we find that it is widely varying. Imagine in Ladakh, it is 6:1, the pupil-teacher ratio. And in Bihar, it's 53:1. Now, does that mean that there's an oversupply of teachers in Ladakh? It definitely seems to be the case that in Bihar, there is severe undersupply of teachers, isn't it? I mean, there's just one teacher to 53 students. But then when we pause and think again, is it really oversupply? Consider Ladakh. It's a Himalayan region. Very, very widely dispersed populations, small habitations, difficult terrains to cross. But then you want to make schools accessible. And when you make schools accessible, you have to deploy teachers. So some of these low pupil-teacher ratios are actually well justified. Because when you want to provide teachers at the school level, when you want to make the school accessible to the student, you will have to provide, quote unquote, more teachers than the pupil-teacher ratio. So the pupil-teacher ratio is like a rule of thumb. It isn't something to be used in a very literal way. Obviously, a school should have adequate teachers. That is like the starting point. So the pupil-teacher ratio is more like a proxy to indicate to you whether adequate teachers in a system or not. But we cannot literally interpret pupil-teacher ratios to mean oversupply and undersupply, because we have to factor in these local conditions on teacher deployment. We also find that 24% of all schools that have a pupil-teacher ratio of more than 35:1, 81% of these are in rural. I mean, 24% of all schools have this pupil-teacher ratio of more than 35:1. And 80% of all these schools are actually in rural areas. So it gives you an idea, right? That in rural areas, there seems to be a problem of teacher deployment. And for making it attractive for teachers to work in rural areas is something for which we need some kind of a policy response. We also find that 9.5% of government schools continue to be single teacher schools. And 91% of these single teacher schools are located in rural areas. This is again an indicator of teacher deployment difficulties that are faced in rural areas. We looked at qualification. And you may recall that last year in November, there was this newspaper report that first the High Court of Rajasthan, and then it was endorsed in the Supreme Court, that if you want to teach in primary school, a B.Ed degree is not appropriate. You should have a DLEd or a BLEd degree. That is the appropriate qualification for a primary school teacher. And we found that only 46% of primary school teachers actually have this appropriate qualification. And out of this, almost 67% of those in government schools have this qualification. And in the private school, it's as low as 20 to 25%. So there is a qualification mismatch at the primary school level. And we do, now that you have worked in the education sector, I think you will begin to appreciate what the point that I'm making. When you have trained as a B.Ed teacher, you have trained as a subject teacher for science, for social science. You have not trained as a generalist teacher to work in the primary school. And that is a problem. You would not have preparation of understanding young children. You would not know how to organize, holistic education with music, art, physical education, and so on in the primary school. Now, you may say that, look, what you're saying is an ideal. Maybe in your experience, you're finding that even teachers with this qualification are not really able to handle the FLN curriculum. Maybe that is your reaction. But my argument will be that they are better positioned to handle the FLN curriculum compared to people with BLEd, with B.Ed degrees. And at least if they're not well prepared, we must work on the DLEd curriculum. But we cannot dismiss the question of appropriate qualification at this level. I've put up the statistics of states with high levels of single teacher schools. I don't seem to find Madhya Pradesh in this list, so I'll find where Madhya Pradesh is in this. We also went into schools, and this data we got from schools. We didn't get it from you guys. We looked at the academic qualifications of teachers and the subjects that they were being asked to teach. And we found at the meta level, about 70% of teachers are teaching subjects in which they have the appropriate academic qualification. This is in middle and secondary schools, which is great. That means I was expecting to find much higher mismatch of appropriate subjects and subjects that you've been asked to teach in school. And I was fairly, reassured that the 70% of teachers are teaching subjects for which they have the undergraduate qualification. They may not have the professional degree, but they do have the appropriate undergraduate qualification. But we found that the mismatches are very high in the case of mathematics and in science and English as well. So these are areas in which there was mismatch. We found that in government schools, there is insufficient teachers for physical education, art, music, and overall there is insufficient special educators in government schools. Private schools did much better when it came to providing for physical education, music, and art as compared to government schools. In fact, in the government schools, the percentages are really low. They are between 1 to 16% of government schools having the right teachers for these areas of the curriculum. Again, from the FLN curriculum point of view, you will recognize why it is so important in the primary school to have teachers of this kind. And you will yourself have realized already that the success of the FLN curriculum is really about the success of a holistic curriculum being provided to teachers. It's not just the narrow focus on skills of literacy and the skills of numeracy, but those skills are acquired in a more holistic development of the child. And all of these contribute to the overall confidence, self-efficacy, agency, and the desire to participate in schooling regularly. All of these contribute to that holistic education. And the FLN, in my view, the FLN mission should equally pay attention to ensuring that these aspects of the curriculum are addressed. Also, I find that in the FLN mission, we don't talk too much about the need for inclusive schools and special educators. But I think that we must pay more attention to it so that, problems of learning disabilities do not become, do not go out of proportion by the time the child is in middle school, and we are able to address it to appropriate pedagogical response in the early grades itself. Let's move to the next slide. So this is just a deep dive into this question of teacher availability, so we can just skip this slide. Let's move to the next one. No, I'm giving a talk. Just a minute, please. Yeah, sorry. Maybe I'll just pause for a few minutes. If any of you have any questions or comments about what I've spoken so far, we can take a look at it. Otherwise, I want to talk a little bit about gender balance in the workforce. Do any of these observations relate to things that you have been seeing in terms of demographic availability of teachers in schools? Okay, feel free to just add it to the chat box. And I'll continue in that case. Yeah? Okay. So let me come to the question of gender balance. I think these statistics I have already flagged to you. And I've also flagged to you the feminization of the contractual workforce as compared to the regular employment. Basically signaling to you that the shifts in a gender balance, on the one hand, is a positive indicator that there are more educated women who meet the eligibility qualification requirements And so it is a good indicator that, the women's education has resulted in more women entering into the workforce. But it also indicates to you that perhaps teaching is less attractive for men who do not wish to be who would rather not be working at low wages in a contractual situation, because these wages are really like a second income in a home. And if the expectation is that a man should be able to earn enough to support the home, then the second income is really not good enough. And the quantum of salary is something that I'll come to in a minute. But mostly when women are teachers in the schools sector, their income is treated as a second income. And therefore not much attention is paid to how low it is. It is very difficult. It's becoming more and more difficult to aspire to, manage a household on the kind of salaries that are now currently there in the system. And that's the kind of, negative look that we're seeing in the feminization of the sector. Let us move to the next slide. I also indicated to you that the women from the SC/ST community is much lower. So that clearly means that while overall the education of women is going up, it is still far from the national averages where concerns the SC/ST community. And this is again a question of a negative feedback loop. Because if we don't have enough role model women teachers in schools from these communities, then it's going to be more difficult for young girls to feel they belong in the school space and have the desire to succeed. In fact, there is interesting and important research which is demonstrating that learning achievement is higher when the social gap between the teacher and the student is smaller. And this is actually empirically established as well. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah. So we can clearly see that the feminization of the sector is important for us to pay attention, because if we think that the gender balance is the norm and we should seek to achieve gender balance, then when we see feminization, it should raise an alarm bell that something is not okay if something is getting so feminized. At least we should look at it deeply. Maybe it's feminized for good reasons, but it shouldn't be feminized for the wrong reasons. When we dive into and look at working conditions of teachers, we looked at, of course, the working conditions from the gender balance lens, but we also looked at working conditions to compare between government and private schools to understand key differences there. We found that in private schools, there are generally more support staffs available to run the school, but government schools are much lower, badly placed when it concerns availability of support staff. I'm sure you have already seen that in the schools that you have visited. But government schools do receive more interaction and support from, the SMCs, the school monitoring committees. We find that government school teachers report having higher administrative workloads. 40% of them are saying it. And 40% of all teachers are saying that they don't feel they have control over their curriculum. I feel that this statistic is important because from our point of view, a teacher should experience professional control and autonomy over the curriculum. And if she feels she's not in the having control over the curriculum, either it is the management dictating or some intervention which is micromanaging the work of teachers. Both government and private school teachers said they are teaching about 27 to 28 periods in a week, and that is a fairly high workload. We found that the employment terms for teachers in the private sector are highly unfavorable. We find that private teachers who have long contracts at about more than 3 years, their salary is about 60% that of the. I'm really sorry, there's a lot of background noise, isn't it? I hope it's not interfering too much. Maybe I'll shut the window. Just give me a minute. I hope it will be better now. Yeah. So as I was saying, the employment terms of private school teachers are generally unfavorable. And we find that teachers who are working on no contracts or their 1-year contracts, they're just earning about 35% of what a government school teacher would earn. We find that 50% of private school teachers are actually working with no contracts. In other words, it's just an oral agreement between them and the school owner, entrepreneur. And that's the kind of working condition in which they are. We also find that about 57% of private school teachers are not eligible for any kind of benefit. They don't get vacation pay. They don't get leave. There's no leave policy for them. There is absolutely no medical or any other coverage. And I'm sure all of you are already saying, oh, this is a fiction. Who gets these things? But when we consider that teachers are actually like frontline workers, and if you want teachers to work with dedication in these contexts, you should be thinking about, the benefits that they receive as well. So when we look at remuneration, we should be looking at both wages as well as benefits together. They don't even get maternity leave. Teachers in the private school. So that is the really very, very difficult circumstances in which private school teachers work. And you can already begin to see why then is the sector becoming feminized. In the box next to it, we've also enumerated many other comparative metrics between government and private schools. And I'm sure you will find it interesting to go through as you understand more deeply the working conditions of teachers. So there are difficulties in both of the sectors. It's not like either of the sector is better off on the whole as compared to the other. We have also looked at the availability of working conditions, the quality of the working conditions of teachers. And we find that in general, on many fronts, working conditions have improved compared to the last time we conducted the SoTTTER survey. And this is from the UDAS data itself. But we do find that visits from academic supervisors seems to have gone down in comparison to the 2021 report. In 2023, we find it's decreased by almost 10 to 15% or so. So I'll move on. Before that, I would also like to just draw your attention to the availability of classrooms in good conditions. This is from UDAS data. UDAS data is indicating that only 58% of rural schools have all their classrooms in good working conditions. And this is something for us to be thinking about, the physical infrastructure that is available in schools and the fact that we still seem to be so far away from ensuring this very basic amenity in schools. Let's move to the next. So we do find that there are states, specific regions of the country and states which should raise a red flag. Definitely, Bihar is a state which shows many metrics that it is a state of concern. Both Bihar and Jharkhand, they have very high pupil-teacher ratios. They have a very low proportion of women in the teaching workforce, less than 40%. And they also have very low proportion of teachers with professional qualifications. Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, and MP, 10 to 15% of the teachers in the workforce don't have professional qualifications. We find very high levels of contract teachers in Jharkhand, Chandigarh, Uttar Pradesh, and Daman, Diu, and Dadra Nagar Haveli. And we find very high proportion of single teacher schools in Goa, Arunachal Pradesh, and Andhra Pradesh. So these are certainly states where there are red flags to be raised. We also find that the northeastern region of India has very poor working condition metrics on the whole. When we look at availability of connectivity, electricity, even just road access availability in the Northeast, these are availability of toilets for girls. The metrics from the Northeast are very poor. So these are the difficult circumstances in which teachers are working there. We find that on the whole, when we look at urban-rural comparison, rural schools are faring much worse than urban schools on many metrics. While availability of toilets seems to be on the whole okay, also drinking water. But when we look at access, road access, when we look at availability of classroom conditions and electricity, rural schools are still much worse off as compared to urban schools. This last section is about the quality of teacher supply, and this is based on two sources of data. The first is the analysis of the TET data from one state, and the second is our own primary survey in schools. We found, at least in this one state, when we analyzed TET data, that students who were studying from diets and IACs, a much larger proportion of these students qualified in the TET as compared to students from self-finance colleges. So for us, that is an indication that at least in this one state, better quality students are coming to the diets and the IACs, and the diets and IACs are in a better position to ensure that they're educated and are able to succeed in the TET. Of course, you may question the relevance of TET, as a metric of quality, but in the absence of any other metric, this is the best proxy that we have for quality today. But we also find that overall the scores in the TET exam are quite low. And that does seem to indicate to us that overall the quality of students coming in to pursue teacher education may not be very good, especially in the subjects of mathematics. In the primary school, we find very, very low scores being achieved by students who are even qualifying in the TET. And maybe you're already experiencing this as you go into schools and you engage with in the FLN mission with the numeracy component. Maybe you're already encountering the lack of confidence of teachers to deal with numeracy achievement of their students. So we do think that this data is telling us that the self-finance colleges are absolutely not able to address the quality question. And the low percentages qualifying in TET is really a metric of the self-finance college performance. If you look at the diets and the IACs, we find much higher level of qualification in the TET. In fact, the percentage point differences are 30 to 40% better in the diets and the IACs as compared to the self-finance colleges. We also find that when we look overall, we found that all diets and IACs were able to ensure that at least 50% of their students qualify in the TET. But when we looked at the self-finance colleges, we found that only 7% of the self-finance colleges were able to achieve this. So there again, it's telling you that by and large, the self-finance college seems to be very inefficient when it comes to putting students, ensuring that they pass in the TET itself. So I think that broadly for us is flagging both the question of the quality of, the preparedness. What does the curriculum have to address? Definitely the DLED curriculum has to address mathematics teaching much more robustly than it is doing today. That's the first point. And the second point is that the self-finance colleges and their performance is a very, very serious quality concern. Because what does it mean that you have qualified through a self-finance college, you have a degree that says that you can teach, but you're still not eligible to teach. So there is a very deep contradiction in this situation, and we have to kind of address it appropriately through regulation and policy. Yes. So we also find on the whole that the supply of the next slide is about teacher supply. I won't go into this because we find that on the whole, the sector of special education is almost totally feminized. We went into colleges of special education and they were almost entirely only women. And we found that the Northeast has no institutions for the preparation of special education teachers. We also find that even to date, enrollment of women in physical education colleges is really low. Of course, Madhya Pradesh has one of the most important and oldest physical education colleges in Gwalior. In fact, it stands out as an exemplar for the rest of the country. But still, I think when you look around Madhya Pradesh, you will find overall the enrollment of women into this is quite low. But the promising thing about physical education is that it is becoming more and more attractive. There seems to be this overall greater consciousness of physical fitness in society itself, and that sector is improving. But otherwise, enrollment of women is quite low. So I'll just end with summarizing the key recommendations that we have to make. One is to do with ensuring supply of qualified teachers for primary education. The second is to improve investments and teacher supply in art, music, special education, and to also enhance their employment terms. In fact, the RT unwittingly has allowed this entire sector of teachers to become contractualized and become guest teachers. The employment terms and recruitment of physical education, art, music, and special education in the system needs to be improved. We have to address the question of how to make teacher availability and deployment to rural areas and in the Northeast more feasible. And to a large extent, this has to do, definitely if we can improve basic amenities and working conditions, it will make a difference. But we may also have to incentivize working in difficult to staff areas. The employment of and the regulation of employment terms of teachers in the private schools is emerging as an issue. Just stop to think about it. If about 40% of teachers are in the private schools, then surely the regulatory mechanisms must more closely look at the working conditions of the sector. In fact, we find that private teachers have no unions or associations taking up their issues, while at least the government teachers do. Even contract teachers within the government sectors now have associations and unions representing their issues. But the private school teacher has absolutely no political clout of any kind. And that entire sector is growing, but is also getting depressed in terms of working conditions. Definitely the health benefits and other benefits for all teachers is a concern, and definitely for private and ECCA teachers. The professional working conditions of government school teachers is an area which needs attention, and definitely in pre-service teacher education, curriculum, overall rigor, more attention to subject knowledge competence, especially in mathematics, is a requirement and a concern. And the last set of recommendations, we need to have more pathways of entering into the profession. We're finding an oversupply of B.Ed teachers and undersupply of D.El.Ed teachers. And we should have some ways in which pathways are possible to join the profession. Most older people wanting to enter into the teaching profession, and we find that in the private teacher education colleges, the average age is actually quite high compared to. So we are finding many people are looking at teaching as a second career later in life. And these are unlikely to go into D.El.Ed colleges. They're likely to go into B.Ed colleges because they have that undergraduate qualification already. So we should have a way of having a 2-year primary school teaching qualification at the B.Ed level as well. Generally, we need to increase government funding for pre-service teacher education. And I think at least from this one state, there's very strong evidence that the government-funded institutions are doing a better job when it comes to teacher preparation. The women from SC, ST communities, especially the scheduled tribe communities, we must find ways to enhance their participation and becoming teachers, and also find ways of strengthening women's enrollment into physical education. Similarly, we have to find ways of supporting and enhancing the enrollment of men in special education. And finally, we need to find ways to monitor more closely the deployment of science, maths, and English teachers. And in fact, the UDAS data has this information, at least it is collected at the state level, but right now it's not available for analysis. So at least at the state level, we should be able to gather this data and examine the question of teacher deployment more carefully. And I think if we did it, probably we will find better ways of understanding and correlating, 10th class performance with teacher availability for subjects at the secondary school level, especially. So thank you. That is the report. And I'm happy to discuss any aspect of the report or any other experiences that you have had with teachers and teacher education in the course of your work. So, Shobha, maybe you can stop sharing the slides and we can just have a discussion now. Thank you.
Arpita raised her hand. So, Arpita, you can go ahead with your query.
Akshita, please unmute and you can ask your question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gaurav. Yeah. Thank you, Padma, for sharing it so elaborate in such an elaborate manner. So one of the experiences that most of us are going through in the field is we understand that on UDICE, the school mentions that how many teachers are there, and we understand that state-wise we can gather an information that um, how many teachers are employed in primary and secondary and middle schools. But what we are seeing is that how these teacher transfers and attachment to different schools happen, because that again becomes a certain, because there have been multiple times where I've been visiting primary schools which might have um, like 5 teachers working in that school, and that makes no sense in comparison to the number of students available in that school, right? But the only excuse that we get is either they are deputed here or they have taken a transfer somehow. So a person who is not like knowledgeable or doesn't have the data how these transfers or deputations happen amongst the teachers. I know there is a lot of political um, they're parts of some unions and they take leverage those things, but does UDICE take into account these happenings of transfers and deputations? And this is also a major issue that's and we have seen it in multiple schools happen.
Absolutely. I think you're quite right. UDICE is not able to capture this micro movement of teachers. It doesn't have, and it's not able to tell you whether a teacher in the school is there on deputation, whether they're regularly employed. We are finding that even that category of contract teachers is very, very open to reinterpretation. So these are not actually very good markers. I mean, the data is not that exhaustive, and maybe it's too much to expect from a UDICE. It gives you a broad picture at a district level, at a state level. And there is no substitute for the micro information that is maintained at the school level and which is available at the block and district level, because that's where these postings and transfers are managed, isn't it? Mostly. But are you also talking about possibility of transfers outside the district, or these are really transfers that are taking place within the district?
So I haven't gone into much deeper asking them, but the surprising factor was that the number of teachers were once, as we talked about single teacher schools, but there have been schools where I've seen five teachers unnecessarily sitting in the school when the number of students would suffice only 2 teachers being in that school.
Right.
So that
We
comes as a
find
very
that-
surprise. Yeah.
Maybe you can also just kind of keep track of what are the motivations for the school to have oversupply. Is it in an urban area and therefore people want to be there? What are the local conditions that might be leading to some schools having oversupply of teachers as much as undersupply in other areas? So if you can keep track of some of these micro details, it will certainly enhance our ability to speak to the question of teacher deployment.
Yeah, surely.
Yeah.
Aditya, you can take the question.
Yeah. Uh, Thank you. Thank you, Padma, for sharing the presentation. I just want to ask you this, that you mentioned that there are 9.5 million teachers right now, and we are all aware about the kind of expectations which we have with them, innovative technology, pedagogy, everything. But the kind of support which we present to them, especially in pre-service education, forget about the private school, the private B.Ed colleges. Even these diets and RIs, there there are, first of all, there's absurd regulation as to who can be a teacher educator. This is beyond comprehension. Second, they are teaching good, but do they prepare teachers for these kind of expectations just I mentioned? Because they go there, form hard pedagogical beliefs, traditional formal teachings, everything is there. Then they come into profession, and a lot of private entities and organizations start their teacher professional development in the different sense. And there is no regulation as to who can be a teacher educator. तो एक तरफ तो बहुत strict regulation है, दूसरी तरफ बिल्कुल strict regulation नहीं है. And even in the light of new education policy, अभी क्या हो रहा है कुछ समझ में नहीं आ रहा है. Apart from this 4-year B.Ed college, B.Ed program, ऐसा लग रहा है कि क्या होगा? Because is it a magical key कि सब solve हो जाएगा? And do we have any evidence for that?
Yeah.
And last thing, ki, why is it so that even if we see this MPNP program or other things, तो बहुत सारे young professionals जो educated हैं अच्छी universities से, they are getting attracted towards NGOs and all these private organizations. They are passionate. वो कम पैसे में भी काम करेंगे remote areas पे, but they are not going to the core teaching profession. So why
Yeah.
they are is not attractive to them?
Well, I think why isn't teaching attractive? I think it's very clear because once you enter into the workforce, in fact, you don't experience very strong agency and autonomy. Very few institutions actually provide you with that sense of achievement when you work in the classroom. Most private school teachers are working in conditions which are very, very pathetic. And they're not valued as professionals. In fact, the attitude of the management of a private school is that you are replaceable. So I don't really matter if you tell me you want to leave tomorrow. I'm not going to make an effort to retain you. Right? So basically private school teachers are like private schools, mostly which are available widely. Forget about the elite private schools. These are very, very difficult spaces to work with. And these are the schools that are actually now catering to the same population that used to go into the government school, right? We're not talking about the elite schools, which are anyway catering to the middle class, the upper middle class, and the elites. And we would want that many more of you who are aspired, motivated, want to make a difference to teaching in the classroom, working in these kinds of settings. So I think the entire quality of the professional status is very, very against the likelihood of people like you entering into the teaching profession to work in such contexts. The whole system is not geared to enabling you. So you might join an NGO school perhaps and feel satisfaction of having made a difference to children from marginalized communities. But the mainstream of school is not that. And the mainstream of schools, even catering to these populations, is not actually looking for people like you to join, because they would want people who are willing to be controlled, who don't have a point of view of their own, and who are willing to work for very low wages to really join them. So that is like a very, very deep contradiction in which we are finding ourselves today. The entire rise of this private sector and how it is distorting the professional chances. It's right now in a very vicious negative feedback loop kind of cycle. And I'm not very sure how it's going to get better unless government recruitment becomes much more robust and more government schools are opened, which signals strongly equality. I think that's really what we are going to need to shift this employment landscape within which the system is functioning. I think on the question of who becomes a teacher educator, you're quite right. There's over-regulation of pre-service teacher education and no regulation of in-service teacher education. Absolutely none. To be honest with you, at this point of time, I'm not in favor of regulating in-service teacher education because I feel that no regulation is better than bad regulation. Bad regulation has very, very negative effects on the sector, and we're already seeing it in the pre-service space. I constantly ask myself, is bad regulation, would it have made much difference if we had no regulation at all? At least then we would have had maybe more innovation in the sector rather than where we find ourselves with a lot of bad regulation. So I'm not at this point going to make an argument favoring the entry of regulation into the in-service, but I will say, and maybe you've all already experienced it, that the ability of in-service to impact in a sustainable way the practices of teachers is actually quite limited. And there is no indication that that is going to change in the short run. Because once the professional identity and the notion of practice has formed in the pre-service space and in the life of the newly qualified teacher, it is almost impossible to introduce change into it. It's extremely difficult. It requires a lot of motivation, a lot of monitoring to sustain it. And that's really because the core beliefs of teachers, the notions of practice, the notion of the professional responsibility of the selves, these get formed in the pre-service space. And I feel we have to pay much more attention to reforming the pre-service sector, because then there's a teacher identity which can sustain curriculum reforms. So I'm not saying stop what we're doing in the service space, but don't do it at the expense of the attention that the pre-service requires. And I think that's where I'm hoping the sector will move. On the ITEP question, I'm not very sure where we are going to be. If you look at who is taking up ITEP, we find that it's still supplying only B.Ed students. There's very little bit in the ITEP which is actually catering to primary and elementary schools. So I would say that ITEP has to pay more attention to primary and elementary schools. And maybe then we can speak about whether it's offering us a genuine reform.
Shefali, you can take the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Padma, for insightful report. So it's not a question; it's my concern about the report. Like report mentioned, 51% teachers are women and 67% teachers are women in urban area. But if we talk about the vocational education and physical education, the percentage was low. And
Really
if
low.
we compare to male and female teachers, so comparison, the female teachers are more. But my concern is that if we talking about the school leadership position, so the female teacher percentage was low. So
Yeah.
what are the reasons of female teacher percentage is low in school leadership position?
Yeah. So we have not we have not investigated the question of why that is so. But this is a trend which is not unique to only schools. Even generally in higher education and even in women in science, we find that moving into leadership positions still seems to be largely there's a very strong gender bias and gendering of leadership positions. It could be that women themselves don't seek to move into leadership positions, and we do find this to be the case. And you might have seen it even in MP. If you look at the number of women in block and cluster resource centers, you'll find it is much lower. It's mostly male dominated. And it seems to be that because working hours become more irregular, working hours can become longer. It's a lot of movement and travel that's involved. So maybe there is some amount of self-selection that women are not choosing to go into those roles. But it could also be that there is a gender bias when it comes, especially in the private schools, of the business being run by the man. And so the male is in the leadership position in the private sector. In the government, perhaps we will begin to see a difference. As I mentioned to you, the older government workforce is more male. The younger government workforce seems to be more women. So maybe over time, we are going to see more women in leadership positions. But this perception that leadership takes you, actually starts becoming more demanding. You have to interact with a lot of strangers in a leadership position. These kinds of things, there seems to be a cultural process in play when it concerns women entering into leadership positions.
Chalu?
Thank you, Shobha. Thank you, Padma ma'am, for sharing the report. Just adding to what Shefali said and then how you responded to it. I also felt in these 6 months that there are also no women in the leadership space right now who can actually represent and give more chances to other women, because while we, like, it's a very small example, while we were selecting MTs to travel with us to Bhopal for the training,
Right.
In my office, everybody suggested that let's not take female MTs because it'll be a hassle. So I
Yeah.
just simply said that if I am traveling, then they can too,
They
right?
can,
So,
right.
and I have seen this as a trend that they actually avoid sending female MTs to Shakshik Samvads, or there are
Yes.
very less female CACs who are actually working very,
Well, yeah.
actively, but still the males around them feel that they're actually doing a favor to them by
Yeah.
not taking them along, uh, because the argument was simply that she will be uncomfortable. But
Right.
I
Right.
was adamant that have you ever asked them that you
Mhm.
think that you are doing a favor to them, but have you ever have a discussion with them that what is actually a favor? We are not giving them opportunities only on the basis that we feel they'll be uncomfortable in traveling. So
No, I think
just
that's a great insight on how, it's not just the official opportunity, but even how opportunities are distributed, isn't it? This perception that traveling, meeting strangers is not suitable and women may not want to do it is also a very strong perception. Absolutely right. So in a way, the social capital that you build then gets very gendered. And yeah, absolutely. I think that was a great example you shared. We should be, therefore, uh, maybe enabling more women to be represented in leadership positions so that somewhere this gets corrected.
Uh, so we are having a very interacting session, and it's a pleasure for us to have with us Dhanraju sir, director. The RSK is also with us. And sir, if you are there, I would really appreciate, or I would really request you to, close the session with your remark.
Morning, Padmaji and Shobha and all our colleagues who have joined from Madhya Pradesh. I mean, I don't have much to. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Perfectly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. See, I don't want to, spoil the entire sequence that Padmaji has put in by either paraphrasing or summarizing what she said. But, you know, anybody who is worried and concerned about the ecosystem knows these problems. Uh, and there have been efforts at various levels, various geographies to address these issues. And but with a heavy heart, I should accept that we have not been able to, address most of them. Still, there is lot of ground to cover. Having said that, there are a couple of things which really worry somebody who is sitting as an administrator. One, for a state like Madhya Pradesh, uh, at least one third of the state is populated by tribal population. And I always hear whenever there is a discussion that, we've not been able to find at least teachers uh, from these communities. And the data shows that teaching is the last profession that anybody who is capable of finding some other job would opt for. That means we are really failing, huge population all these years. That is something which really worries me. And the study also shows that there are not even teachers from tribal communities, which again, complicates the things further. And you added a very pertinent point, Padmaji, that when the social gap between teacher and student is narrower, the outcome is slightly better. That would lead us to seriously think that we should rope in more teachers from tribal communities probably. Secondly, one thing that has been seriously missed by most of the governments, as far as I understand, is investing on the professional development of teachers, uh, I mean, we really try to keep away from pre-service for whatever reasons, and don't invest and compensate for it when they enter the service. So these two things should again worry somebody who is administering the education sector. One, having a serious intervention on the pre-service and heavily investing on the in-service. Without that, I don't think we would be able to do any justice to our children. So I think all said and done, uh, again, NEP talks about ITEP. You made a pertinent point that what about the ECCE, FLN grades, how ITEP is going to address these issues. We have to see how the things unfold, but uh, these things are really going to be important, because until unless ECCE and FLN grades are really taken care, we are not going to achieve much in the higher grades, as the learning gap would increase further. So, as usual, Padmaji, your presentation leaves more questions and more worries to me than having some kind of solace and satisfaction. But that's always good, because these things keep worrying us. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and I have a hard copy of it. I'll go through it in greater details. I'm sure in most of the problematic areas, Madhya Pradesh would be one of the prominent state appearing in most of these things. Thank you so much, and best wishes for